My good friend Vijay Prashad is the director of Tricontinental. And my goodness, we've got tricontinental issues to discuss with him this evening. He's the editor of Leftward Books and chief reporter at Globetrotter. Good to see you back again, Vijay. Thanks for joining us. If you don't mind, I'll ask for your reflections on this, the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. For those of us d'un certain âge, we have no need to be reminded of what happened in Bandung 70 years ago. And those of us married to Indonesians, even more so. But there's a whole generation, 2 generations out there, that have forgotten the spirit, the meaning of Bandung. Please educate us.
Well, first, George, it's great to be with you again, and happy Easter. I can see that you, of course, are running a poll of great importance. This morning, I was talking to a friend about how there's, in fact, a grave for Jesus in Kashmir, because there's a story that Jesus at resurrection leaves the cave and goes to India and dies in India several years later. On Bandung, it's important for people to understand that it's a conference that took place in 1955, 29 African and Asian nations, most of them newly freed, India, 1947, Pakistan, 1947, Sri Lanka, 1948, Indonesia, 1948, China, 1949. I mean, these countries, epochal national liberation movements, the leaders come to Bandung with a mandate from hundreds of millions of people to reshape the world order. In fact, these are leaders who are not afraid of their people. At Bandung, under the I think very sensitive direction of President Sukarno, the leaders left their hotel at the first day of the conference and walked down the street. There was no armed car, there was no guns. They walked amongst the people to the venue for the conference. They came there and they discussed effectively what hundreds of millions of people wanted, which was the unraveling of the old colonial order, the economic order, the political order, the social order, the cultural order. There was a lot of discussion about racism and so on. It's important to point out that even though there was some pressure to invite Israel to the Bandung conference, the country said no. The organizers said that Israel is a settler colony, and they stood in solidarity with the Palestinians. This conference that took place 70 years ago set in motion a dynamic, creating in 1961 the non-aligned movement, an important institution of the poorer countries of the world. And in 1964, it was this Bandung spirit that created the UN Conference for Trade and Development, which sought to revise the international economic order. It has to be said that the Bandung spirit ran out of gas in the 1980s during the very severe debt crisis that afflicted the third world, starting with Mexico, a major country that defaulted and went bankrupt in 1982. But George, ever since the collapse of the Western economies led because of the subprime economic crisis, there has been a resurrection in a way of the countries of the global south led by China. And this has created a new kind of spirit. It's not the same as Bandung. I don't think we should be naive or nostalgic about it. There is definitely a new mood in the global south. It's not a repeat of Bandung, but it's important for us to remember Bandung in order to understand the developments taking place nowadays.
Amen to that. Does BRICS in any way represent something of the spirit of Bandung? It's a collection not only of poor countries, of course. Some of the richest countries in the world are now members of BRICS. But is it informed or moved by the same kind of spirit?
See, it's really interesting, George, because in 2007, 2008, there was this major financial crisis in the United States and in Europe. And these countries really have never recovered from it. This financial crisis was deepened by the COVID pandemic and then further by the war in Ukraine. It's not really recovered. You can see that the Trump tariffs are going to hurt a little bit if he puts them back into effect for Europe and other places. But it's not like Europe has had a boisterous growth rate for the last decade or so. It's been in really bad shape. For this reason, countries like India, China, Indonesia, and so on decided, look, we can't rely on Europe and the United States to buy our goods and services. We're going to have to start selling to each other. And that was the impetus in 2009 for the first BRICS meeting. Ever since then, the BRICS has largely talked about trade, increasing trade south to south. This has been very important. The Belt and Road Initiative from China, very much a part of this. It's only very slowly that these countries have developed, let's call it what it is, political confidence to criticize the West. I mean, let's face it, George, about 80% of world military spending is spent by the United States and its NATO allies, 80%. Even the toughest countries in the BRICS, okay, Russia, China, they fear the wrath of the United States. Iran fears the wrath of the United States. The United States is a reckless, decadent powerhouse in the world. You know, it is capable of destroying cities like a barbarian, as it destroyed Baghdad, as it basically has underwritten the destruction of Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. So these countries understand the military power of the United States is formidable. In that sense, they have not yet had the confidence to push a strong political agenda. This is what differentiates the current rise of the BRICS from the Bandung Spirit. It's really economics that's in the lead, not politics. At Bandung, it was politics in the lead, not economics. So I'm looking forward to the time now when countries like China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil will be much more politically clear and inform the West that the West's sort of decadent policy framework is no longer going to be actually acceptable, not only to these countries but to the world's peoples.
Yeah, it's a kind of straitjacket. We'll come back to the violence being wreaked but through proxy wars, the proxy war in Ukraine, the proxy war against the Palestinian people in Gaza, in Jerusalem, and in the West Bank. But let's go to the direct savagery of US and UK, and that you may tell me there are others, ferocious violence being meted out to the poorest people on the planet in Yemen, who are right now under savage bombardment by the United States directly, with no legal authority of any kind. And you've recently been talking about that. I think you may even have been recently there. How do you see that? How can they get away with that?
It's very interesting, George, that the United States and the Israelis have decided to dismantle what the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani had built so carefully. See, the Iranians understood after the US bombardment of Iraq that their time was short, that they needed to find a way to protect Iran. United States could destroy Iran any minute. So what General Qasem Soleimani did was quite intelligent. I mean, they buffered the Hezbollah ranks, helped Hezbollah shape its defensive capability against the Israelis. It built up the forces inside Iraq and inside Syria to defend the people against imperialist attack. And at the same time, they helped to some extent, marginally. Their help is actually very exaggerated, but they did help the Yemenis to defend themselves against destruction. And the idea was that this was an insurance policy for the Iranians. If the United States dared to attack Iran, Iran's insurance policy would come and strike U.S. targets in the Middle East, but also would strike Israel. Over the course of these last 18 months, the United States and the Israelis have been dismantling this insurance policy, what is sometimes called the resistance. They have bombarded Hezbollah, killing Sheikh Syed Hassan Nasrallah. They have overthrown the government in Syria, putting in place a government whose leader, former Al-Qaeda, has now said that by next year he wants to establish relations with Israel. They've basically really damaged Hamas, not destroyed it. Hamas is still capable of fighting back against Israel, but has been weakened. And the only power that has remained and continues to try to attack Israel is Yemen. And that is the reason why the Yemenis are paying in blood from the United States. It actually shows you that it's not been an Israeli genocide against the Palestinians solely. This is an Israeli United States assault on the Palestinians and an assault on the regional elements that have been either defending the Palestinians or were part of this insurance policy for Iran. The Yemeni people have taken it, George, in the neck from the Saudis for the last decade. They have not flinched. They continue to fight back. They are a resilient people. They have a long history of struggle going back almost 100 years. I don't think the United States with its bombing is going to actually break their will. It is harming a lot of people. I am not one of those who says, well, go on and try and bomb, they will fight. This is a savage bombardment, as you quite rightly said. It needs to be condemned. Very few people are talking about it. I don't know the role of the British government in this bombing, but I would be very, very surprised if Britain is not directly involved. As you know, the British base at Cyprus was used by the United States and the Israelis for targeting against the Palestinians in Gaza. All of Britain is bathed in the blood of this genocide. It is a shame. I mean, we know, George, that the anti-colonial project, which we're talking about when we mention Bandung, has its roots in Ireland, in the struggles of the Irish people, in your own Scottish fight against English rule or dominance. I mean, this is a long fight we have. Britain has a long history of imperialism. Unfortunately, it's not a history, it's in the present. When you talk about the harassment faced by people, British nationals being faced by the British state, this is exactly what was faced by anti-colonial activists 100 years ago. Indian activists living in Britain, African activists living in Britain, Irish activists living in Britain faced terrible, terrible repression from the British state. I would not be surprised if Britain is playing a direct role alongside the United States in the bombardment of its former colony in Yemen.
Well, and this being Easter, we recall the great rising of the Irish people at Easter 1916, which was the first of the armed and organized rebellions against the British Empire, and would ultimately, of course, within a few years, prevail and a form of independence secured, though the whole country is not yet free. Let's finish, if we can, Vijay, on the situation in Gaza. It's almost beyond belief what's happening. Not just Gaza. In my monologue, I talked about the savagery meted out, even to the Pope's envoy in Jerusalem today. The savagery of the military and the settlers in the occupied West Bank territories. But Gaza is something that we haven't actually seen the likes of before. There have been the likes before, but we didn't see them. The difference here is that we all, whenever we open our telephones, see the barbarism on display. And of course, the barbarians are the forces of Israel, led by Netanyahu. But the means by which this savagery is meted out are all provided by the United States. What's in it for the United States to cover itself in so much innocent blood, to keep a tiny country on the Mediterranean happy? It seems a disproportionate cost, doesn't it?
Well, I'm going to be pretty straightforward, George, because you're a straight shooter, so you'll appreciate this. It's a question for Europeans, actually, more than for the United States. Why is Israel a part of Eurovision? Why does Israel, a country in Asia, part of a music contest in Europe, why is Israel play in the European Football League? It's an Asian country. That's because there is an understanding that Israel is a European country. There is an immense quality of racism that applies in this particular conflict. I think of this as an international division of humanity. There's a way in which Palestinians are not seen as human. Israelis are seen as human. This international division of humanity comes out so clearly when you look even at what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, look, for God's sake, when Boris Johnson went to meet Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev, he flew into Kiev airport. The Russians are not bombing Ukraine with anything near the firepower being used by the Israelis against Gaza. There's so much outrage about what's happening in Europe. Oh my gosh, there's a war in Europe. What an absolute catastrophe. It is perfectly acceptable to sell weapons, European weapons, to the people in Sudan so that they can slaughter each other. Or it's perfectly acceptable to savagely bomb in Yemen. It is perfectly acceptable to savagely bomb the Palestinians. There is a kind of patina of racism here going back 100 years when Captain Arthur Bomber Harris, his nickname was Bomber, British Royal Air Force commander in Iraq and in northern, what is now Pakistan, in Waziristan. Bomber Harris said, bombing the natives is a tonic. It is education. When they see our bombs and what it can do, they will learn of our superhuman strength. There is a real element of racism here. I'm uncomfortable with saying this is about oil or this is about this or that. Of course, there may be material interests at play, but there is a way in which this savagery is beyond material interests. Surely it's not just to build the Gaza Riviera. There's a lot of other real estate for that. Surely it's more than that. There is a brutality, a great hatred of the people who are not white, the great hatred that allowed the coups against Patrice Lumumba, the coup against Goulart in Brazil in 1964, and now, just to complete the circle, George, the coup against Sukarno in 1965, where the Australians and the United States and the British pushed the Indonesian military to kill 1 million communists over the course of several weeks. That kind of savagery has its roots in a very ugly kind of imperial racism.